Well, we've covered a lot of territory today, connecting various types of natural and man made disasters to the political and economic and migration issues that we've covered in other weeks to try to look at how natural disasters can affect the systems in which people live and provide incentives to both potentially increase conflict as well as potentially end them, as with the Aceh case. So, connecting back to the motivating question that I asked today, what effects do natural disasters have on human security and conflict? We focused here on how it can affect conflict onset and conflict duration. Duration is a fascinating topic, how conflicts are actually fought and how they end. We haven't focused on as much because the literature doesn't focus on it as much, but there's a lot of opportunities to try to think about how people fight and how wars actually end. Disasters can both, the literature suggests, can both increase and decrease the risk of conflict for the reasons that we touched on, the effects that disaster can have on state and rebel capabilities, as well as interests for people joining the rebel group or trying to decide that this would be the time to try to move on and to unite, rally around the flag effect that we talked about earlier. So while we didn't kind of focus on human security, there are arguably more direct effects that natural disasters have on the various characteristics of human security we've touched on in this class, from life and health and education, ability to have a job and provide food for your family. I think a lot of these are more direct effects that you could find more direct evidence from. It kind of falls out of the scope of political institutions and political behavior that we focus on in this class, but it definitely is another area that I'd like to spend more time on or can talk about in the workshops if you guys are interested. I wanted to connect a lot of these topics into what we're kind of living through now, as well as the way that it's played out over the last 2.5 years, whether it connects with what we would expect should happen given the huge upheaval that we've had in both developed and developing countries. I don't know if you remember, we're paying attention back in March and April of 2020, but there was an effort by the United Nations and Secretary Gutierrez to try to stop conflict, to try to deal with the pandemic. The Secretary General called for a halt to conflict, international and civil, to be able to face the pandemic head on. This received support in the Security Council and backed up by fighting groups within 11 countries. All this just happened in the end of March and the beginning of April in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And there was a lot of hope that given the size and scale of this tsunami of cases, that people would kind of band together to try to address the common challenge. But the difficulty with collective action and with long-term sustained efforts, especially when they might contrast with other interests that states or groups might have. The evidence suggests that it wasn't very effective in the long term. There was a joint report 6 months after this agreement to try to halt conflict that said over 20,000 people had been killed since this call for a ceasefire. And this has been one natural disaster there's been really good efforts at gathering data about, so we can ask a lot of really interesting theoretical questions. Some of them are coming out in journals now. I'm starting to see the first COVID articles come out in Journal of Peace Research and other journals that were peer-reviewed quite quickly, looking at the early stages. But connecting back to those early stages, there was efforts by ACLED, one of the conflict data or political violence data sets we've used so far in this class, and they, like the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker, tried to get as much real-time data on how much this pandemic was having an effect on political violence. And they gathered data for about a year before rolling it into the rest of their normal data collection. That you see there was widespread protests in a number of countries that are here in orange. From the United States, there definitely was some almost all, except for a couple of countries in Latin America, in Europe, in South Asia, and in East Asia, in Indonesia as well, but not in Australia, notably. And so, by and large, that initial report 6 months afterwards said that there wasn't a huge widespread decline in political violence. I just went and looked today and downloaded the data from ACLED, looking at the number of fatalities of all forms of political violence over the last couple of years, and they really have expanded their data coverage to new countries in recent years, so they don't really go back and have large coverage more than to 2018. But you see that there was already a slight decline in conflict from 2018 to 2019 that pretty much led to a slight decline on par with what was normally happening anyway before the pandemic. And then violence actually went up in the number of fatalities in 2021. 2022 data only go through May 5th, I want to say, so far. So there's little evidence that the pandemic actually had a widespread increase in decreasing conflict, at least fatalities around the world, though it didn't really have a huge upswing given the amount of grievances that you've been reading about in the media for the last 2 years, that you would expect, given the voice of dissatisfaction with government's policies, that it might potentially lead to violence. But according to the data that I looked at, that really hasn't happened, at least in the 2021 data, though time will tell over the long term. So yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of left with a question. It'd be interesting to see what you think in your perspective about what we know about disasters and the probability of conflict, why there hasn't been more outbreaks of civil conflict in countries that have really faced the worst of it, or other forms of political violence, protests, demonstrations, election violence, or others. Interested to hear your thoughts for those of you who would care to leave a response in the election questions on Waddle. With that ends what I have today. Now we turn to the readings and get ready for the workshop and start to look at a couple of specific examples of natural disasters to try to connect to these kind of theories that we've touched before to see what effect different kinds of disasters might have. With that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.